Okay, can you hear me okay? Yeah, great, okay. Well, welcome everyone to an Urban Future Exchange panel conversation on creative places for creative industries. My name is Michael Scott, and I'm the treasurer for the Urban Future Exchange, a board member, but also today's host. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge that the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. We also pay respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal people visiting or attending from other areas of South Australia or Australia. So the Urban Future Exchange, formerly the Australian Institute for Urban Studies, is a provocative and politically savvy social enterprise leading progressive discussion in urban studies and related disciplines. Our pursuit is to develop ideas for the urban future of South Australia that promotes health, a confident culture, equity and sustainability. So in our panel discussions, we aim to provoke mature discussion and try and discover and explore some of the nuances within the issues that have otherwise been glossed over or is accepted as knowns. So hopefully today we will challenge some of the ideas and assumptions around the creative city and the creative industries, and maybe give you some food for thought to take back to your own organisations and your own networks. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge also that this event is brought to you by our associates, which include UniSA Creative, Shoal, Jensen Plus, Mache, where we're holding this conversation, and Sustain SA. So, welcome to our panel. Joining me today, we have Michael McEwen, who's an urban planner, urban designer, and director at Jensen Plus.
Hello, everyone.
Josephine Evans, who's an architect, creative industries advocate, and director at JPE Design Studio.
Hello.
And Justin O'Connor, who is Professor of Creative Economy at University of South Australia.
Hi.
Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. So just to give an overview of what we're going to discuss today, our theme is creative places for creative cities. So we posit here that Adelaide is a creative city and South Australia is a creative state. We often talk about developing the right business environment to support the creative industries, but does Adelaide and South Australia have the right urban environments to ensure the sector grows and thrives? So we've got a number of questions, but to set the context for today, is there a kind of an ideal creative industries urban environment, and what might this look like? Are there places or conditions that are more conducive to creative industries than others? There are a number of kind of creative precincts in South Australia already, for example, Tonsley Innovation Precinct, Lot 14. Do we need to develop this idea of specific spaces for creative industries or neighbourhoods? And are there any advantages or disadvantages in doing so? So, with that preamble under our belt, I'm just like to start off with a question. We've got two really big ideas, I think, in this discussion. One is the creative industries, and the other is the creative city. So these are obviously quite broad and debated ideas. I'm just really interested to how you think about these terms, the creative industries and creative cities.
Oh, any particular order?
No particular order. Jump in.
Well, I'm the bad fairy in this. I think creative industries has been a disastrous idea. Creative cities has been an equally disastrous idea. So what we need to do is call a halt and rethink it from scratch. So creative industries, we'll come back to the cities, but creative industries, I was there from the very beginning, 1998, DCMS in London, John Newbigin, who invented the term. And since then, literally, nobody in the whole world has actually worked out what the creative industries is. If anybody can come up with a definition of creative industries, I'll take it. But at the moment, 22 years in, 23 years in, and nobody knows what they are, and I think that's a problem.
Okay. So we're talking about, we're trying to imagine a sector that into being, is that what you're saying? Or does it not even exist?
It's a statistical slide, smoke and mirrors.
Okay.
It doesn't exist. There's no such thing as creative industries. Just a policy construct has gone horribly wrong.
And so, well, that's interesting because Josephine, you've been leading the creative industries submission and advocacy in Adelaide recently and making submissions to the state government. How do you perceive?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So about 2019, as an architect, I was, I suppose, shocked to sort of realise that perhaps we weren't being seen as part of the creative economy or creative sector as such in the eyes of government. There were, I suppose, a few, I'll call them creative industries because that's, I guess, the way it's been categorised. With governments around the world, they often need some kind of category to sort of be able to talk about something. So I decided to bring actually UniSA around the table with about 6 others, including Screen and Research and a few others like Jan Factory and Guildhouse. And we had a discussion around, you know, what is the opportunity, not so much for ourselves, but what's the opportunity to form more of a collective voice and to actually, I suppose, expand on what this category was saying, which was sort of about 4 or 5 particular industries, to really broaden the conversation. And from the energy in the room that day, the idea that we would have some workshops to come up with some ideas and perhaps form some clearer opinions to go back to government with, has now slowly over the years become sort of 9 workshops and 35 peak bodies and others and creative practitioners later. So from that, I think we just identified a need more so to really reveal the grain of what's happening here, and it's so broad. It's not just the really established creative sectors, it's also a lot of emerging, and then of course you've got creative tech. So it is a broad discussion, and there has been lots of discussions, I suppose, about, you know, what does it mean? You know, there's people trying to categorise it again. You know, how do you measure IP? You know, how do you measure creativity? Of course, it can't be put in a box. That's the whole point. So it needs a completely different way of thinking.
Well, you know, there's a lot of things in policy and in our world that aren't very well defined. So it doesn't really surprise me that we might struggle to define the creative industries or creative city. And I hope, from an urban planning point of view, I hope we never have a creative industry zone. You know, that would just be the end as soon as we start doing that sort of thing. Like, I haven't been part of the 9 workshops and thinking as deeply about this as much as you two have. But there's clearly a lot of creative potential, creative people, creative activity. And sometimes it's about harnessing a momentum, which we might find hard to describe or write down or put in a strategy or a policy document, but it can still be there and influence what many of us do in our work, and many others as well.
Right. So with then the argument going back, so Justine, you've been out and you've liaised with people working in what we might call creative sector. So I imagine architects, you mentioned perhaps gaming, the visual arts, the performing arts, which is a defining feature of Adelaide for some people. So there are these sectors, but Justin, are you saying that overarching definition, because in the DCMS document that you worked on, there were those specific industries that were targeted, but then you think that there's nothing that kind of holds them together?
No, First of all, what is it? Industry wealth creation based on individual talent and intellectual property.
Yeah.
That doesn't describe any cultural or creative industry. They've got people work for wages, people sell their IP. It's individual talent. You know, we're talking in the age of Spotify and Amazon. You know, with thousands, millions of employees. So that thing doesn't work. So the definition, which gets wheeled out, as in the recent SA strategy gets wheeled out, doesn't hold water. Nobody thinks that defines the sector. But then the worst thing is that they call it creative, and creative has no limits. A scientist is creative. A financial whiz kid somewhere in New York has thought of a new algorithm that will get them X zillion, gazillion dollars is creative. There is no limit to creativity. And yet they call it the creative sector. And so we don't know where it ends. And of course, nobody knows, there's no strict boxes anyway, we're in an imperfect world. If you go to a dairy industry conference or a car industry conference, or even a gaming industry, everybody in the room knows what they're talking about. Creative industry conferences, nobody knows what they're talking about. And it's a disaster. It's a policy-making disaster.
You can't. Oh, sorry, I don't want to.
Well, I mean, before this discussion, I was thinking, wouldn't it be great for all of our professional practice to be more creative, to have more creative design, more creative financial systems, or more creative government policy? I thought, what a great word, it can be applied so widely. But maybe, Justin, what you're seeing is the true artists perhaps miss out on that, because we might, those of us in the wider community might kind of kidnap the term creative and misappropriate it.
The correct term is art and culture.
Sure.
You talk about art and culture, everybody, as somebody once said, even my grandma knows what we're talking about. They might not know the ins and outs of social media. They know that. You go to some of the most successful strategies, industrial strategies, South Korea, they don't call it creative industries. They actually call it cultural industries or content industries. They're as brutally, commercial as anybody else, but they know, right, we've got to do that. We're going to develop this industry. They throw millions of whatever it is in Korea, Korean things. Same with China, So they put in money. But what we're saddled with is this creative thing that can't inform an industry strategy. Nobody in Adelaide, for instance, we separate what's the DCMS catalogue of creative industries, which goes from architecture and design all the way through to visual arts. They're separated across 3 different ministries, and so even the ministry, even the ministry of what was it, the skills and innovation, Matthew Pistoni's outfit, they're only talking about one little section of it. So it's kind of, there's no policy, there's not even in South Australia, there's no policy object to deal with. It's been separated up. So that's the problem. Nobody really knows what it is. And the solution to it, in Europe, for instance, the solution to it is to separate them out. Creative industries, it's some kind of tech, digital stuff with design. I'm happy with that, that's fine. I think you do need a design strategy. And architecture's role in that is to be talked about. You do need a design strategy. But that's not a creative industry strategy, which, you need something else for the art and cultural industries. So it's just, and that's why, because just to wrap up, that's why we have no policy in Australia. Australia is the only country in the OECD group to have no cultural policy and no creative industry policy. We are right, well, number 20, it's a 20 in the OECD. We're right at the bottom without any policy, strategy, or anything. So we're in a very bad situation in Australia, federally speaking.
But is this just about wording? Because even if you said design or you said culture, there's going to be so many people saying, well, that's multi-dimensional anyway. So whether you choose creative, I guess, are we talking semantics more about sort of language, or is it about categorisation?
Well, it's understanding. Words are not just words. Culture includes creativity, but it also includes celebration, entertainment, pleasure, disturbance, critique, commemoration, solidarity. radical culture is, it's a word that's been with us for certainly for 300 years, and the things that go into culture go back thousands of years, well, 40,000, 50,000 years in the Australian context. Culture's a deep sense of creating meaning in the world. And to see that turn into a create-tech strategy, 20 years ago, it's a deliberate attempt by governments to remove the word culture, reintroduce creativity, and creativity actually is measurable in economic terms. It's an economic input. These are a creative input. The Nesta defined it. Whereas culture is about values, it's about outputs, it's a much more complex thing, and therefore parts of public policy like education and health. But we've had that taken away and put into some kind of bogus industry policy. And the result is, what we got? I could do one of those maps, the more creative industry is used, actual funding for culture goes down. So we've had this massive cutting for culture. It's been marginalised. Nobody cares one jot about it. And yet, at the same time, the idea of creative industry has gone up. So it did its job. It actually removed culture from public policy and shoved it into.
I don't know if I agree with that entirely. And living here in South Australia, as I have for only the last 7 or 8 years, I think there's quite a strong emphasis on art and culture, and that is part of everyone's life, especially in the festival time, which is wonderful to celebrate. I'm sure we still have an arts minister rather than a creativity minister there somewhere. So I think there is still a prominence for art and culture, but maybe it can be clearer. And how it relates to the city and our kind of the future of our city, well, that's another question that we'll probably come to shortly.